the topic that I'd suggested, and again, this is all quite selfish of me because it's things I'm thinking about at the moment for work, but I'm interested in trying to understand better the general picture of what the near to middle term of automation might mean for labor, labor markets. I suppose as you could look at you could look at that through an economic lens, which we often do in our work, but it is obviously bigger than that. And I'm wondering if I have the right sort of general take on the technological disruption of labor by the convergence of robotics, machine intelligence, et cetera, and whether this is likely to be a disruption that sort of fits into the usual disruption box, or whether there's something going on with labor in particular that's sort of maybe qualitatively different, maybe sort of fundamentally different, perhaps. Anyway, it feels as I think through the implications here a little bit, it feels like this is a bigger kind of change, a bigger sort of phase change or sea change or something. Just it feels like a bigger deal to me, even than these other quite fundamental sectors of the economy, energy, for example, being disrupted by a new energy technology. The idea that technology could disrupt the work that humans do, human labor, that seems to me to be something really quite extraordinary. Perhaps even sort of, well, I don't know about unprecedented, but certainly in the bucket of extraordinary as far as disruptions go. And my team has really avoided talking about this or thinking of spending too much time on it. But I'm starting to get the feeling that we can't really dodge this elephant in the room for that much longer. We're going to have to address it because it keeps creeping into other conversations, and we keep sort of brushing it aside or brushing it under the rug. But I think we've done that because my team and I can sense that this is a big game changer, and it may involve developing an approach or tools or something like that we haven't got yet to even get a handle on it. So anyway, I thought I'd take the advantage of this sort of having some good brains here to see what you guys think, and maybe get your general input and your general feel for this situation. Maybe get a sense of what we think a realistic timeline is. What forms of human labor could plausibly be automated with foreseeable advancements in the state of the art that's relevant. So in robotics and in, for lack of a better word, the software behind the intelligence that drives machines that can drive automation and machine labor in general, if those two aren't synonymous. And if we want, I don't know how much time we've got today, but if we have the opportunity, maybe today, maybe next time as well, we could perhaps start thinking about what the steps between here and a highly automated world, and by that I mean a world in which there has been large scale, widespread deployment of this technology, and what that what does it's I think the temptation is to leap way ahead and say, okay, what does the world look like when machines are doing all the work, et cetera, et cetera. But again, the much harder part is what does the journey from here to there look like, and is it going to follow something like this, the S curve, the sigmoid sort of curve that we see in other disruptions, or is something different going to happen here? Anyway, I thought I would just get this, all of that out on the table and see what we make of it, because I'm starting to think about this not just casually, but more formally. Yeah, because I think we can't. I think there's only so long we can ignore this elephant in the room before we're really gonna have to tackle it head on. So.
Yeah, cool. It's an interesting debate. There's very active economic literature on both sides of this. One, I guess, saying, well, people have been saying since the Luddites that technology would end the need for humans in labor, and it never seems to quite happen, and this time will just be like that. That's the status quo. This time isn't different take. And those people point to the fact that even, I'm not sure if this is quite correct, but I think it's right that you might have expected much higher productivity gains from IT back around 2000 or between 2000 and 2010, but it took a long time to show up in the productivity figures, apparently. I may be getting this wrong. So although the internet and computers definitely did something, it's not so clear they were as transformative to productivity, and that is the ratio of output to input of workers. And people point to, even though there's been a lot of improvement in the technology in, say, deep learning or even areas of robotics that are starting to be touched by it, people are pointing to the fact that it doesn't seem to show up dramatically in the figures yet as evidence that they're right, that this time is no different and workers will be fine. On the other side, you have, well, of course, there are people like Kurzweil and others who would plot us at some point towards the singularity, at which stage humans are not much good for anything. But within the economics profession, I guess two books that come to mind immediately, you must be familiar with these, Adam, is Brynjolfsson. I don't know, Brynjolfsson?
Yeah.
Brynjolfsson.
Yeah.
And Andrew McAfee's
McAfee,
books.
yeah.
McAfee, right? Race Against the Machine and Second Machine Age. I thought there was one with a title that had something like Light at the End of the Tunnel, but I couldn't quite find it Googling now. I thought there was an earlier one that I'd looked at before these two. But those people would say something like, no, this time is different. This is automation is going to reduce a large number of white-collar jobs, as well as the previous waves of automation dealing with more blue-collar jobs. And I don't actually know which one I believe myself, I guess. You could always point to the possibility that there will be new jobs, right? The characteristics of jobs will just change. You know, there will be TikTok tutors instead of factory workers. So I guess if you imagine a highly automated world, are we trying to think about a path towards a world where humans really just, their labor just isn't useful, or that it's just transformed into kinds of labor we want other humans to do for us and not things that we currently think of as the primary activities for human labor?
Yeah, I think that's a really key and insightful question, right? And what it points to is some nomenclature, some set of definitions about what forms of activity constitute value creation, which ones deserve the title labor, which ones we can or might or should, these are all different questions, but which ones we could or should formalize within, the contractual economy. In other words, which ones should we organize jobs around, or occupations or careers or employment? What forms of activity that are in some way productive, in some way, create value by through human time and effort, and which tasks are if any, are severable from that and can simply be done by, I guess, what you might think of as capital. In other words, what you might think of as machines or equipment or something. Maybe I think that's a reasonably good bucket. We'll stick with that one for now. That can produce the again. I don't have a great lexicon for all of this stuff yet, but that can produce sort of the basic material goods and perhaps also services that people require to have some semblance of modern quality of life. So I'm thinking the provision of food, of raw materials that take the form of some sort of finished goods that are manufactured, the infrastructure and the provision of water and other electricity and other utility services. I'm thinking things like transportation. Actually, probably that's one of the first ones that will come if autonomous vehicles are sort of an initial, very high-profile example. Sort of a killer app of automation, as I think many expect may happen. So this is all to say that there are a lot of different things that humans do in an economic context that today are jobs that we get paid for. There's a contract. We put in the time and effort. We do some sort of productive activity, some set of tasks. It rearranges the stuff of the world, the materials, the information, the combination thereof in some sort of useful way. And we are, through a contract, we make an exchange. Money is a mechanism for the claims that we get to make as a result of that conflict against that other value elsewhere in the system, in the economy. And so, we work, we get paid, and then we can take that money as a claim against other things that we either need or want, and so on. And what I'm wondering, I guess, is I suppose my real question is more on for the time being, my interest here, and the big question mark hanging over in my mind is less on the what happens to jobs and employment and all of those arrangements, sort of the general social contract that you exchange your blood and sweat and tears for money that you can then claim against other value. I'm thinking more about if machines start doing all the stuff that involves taking raw materials, combining them with energy and some sort of intelligence, and rearranging them in ways that then allow people to survive in some semblance of modern comfort, then we're still doing a lot of not the right way to say it. I'm trying to avoid things like words like production, but maybe I can't. In other words, I can imagine a scenario in which machines do a lot of the toil and much of the basis of human material needs are met fairly straightforwardly, and that transforms the condition in which we have found ourselves throughout human history, which is primarily one of scarcity, into one of abundance, at least in a material sense. And then, of course, there will be implications of that socially and for employment, for jobs. And then what do people do? And can we explore entirely new frontiers for the creation of value with our time and so forth? But I'm thinking more in terms of the sort of the basic, simple primary sector sort of sense. That what happens when machines start doing all of that work, and what happens if those things, as a result of sort of the way that machine labor can scale and recursively sort of supply itself with its own needs. You can imagine, if robots need energy, then they can build the solar panels, they get the energy, and if they need to build more robots, then robots can do the building of more robots, and obviously they can be trained very quickly because it's a download, it's not a 20-year education process, and so on. And so you have this you can imagine sort of an explosion of efficiency in which very quickly the entire system of material provision basically becomes self-powering, it seems to me that could lead to a state of abundance in a way that we have not seen before. And I'm wondering how quickly that could happen, and what the steps along the way look like. And anyway, that's where most of my
yeah, I think
most of my question is, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I think that's a good area to focus on, because it's less subject to drifting off into the nether of just speculative sci-fi activity. Yeah, while you were talking, I was thinking about if we just step back a bit and think about from the point of view of the plants on Earth, we already occupy the very easy part of the production scale, where they do all the hard work of, the producing carbohydrates and useful molecules from just sunlight and water, and then that's in a sense the true primary production layer underneath everything, right?
Yeah, you're right. We call that in ecology and environmental science, we call that primary production, right? I mean, it's
so I guess, if the farming system, for example, just becomes much more automated, or it's precision fermentation and many other things like that, I suppose we just stop thinking about it as actually being industrial activity at some level, right? If it's sufficiently automated, it's not like farming is really automated. It's not. It feels like hard work, but it's not that the actual productive process taking place inside the plants requires direct supervision or input from us. We manage the environment and the external conditions to make sure that process continues, and that still takes effort, but it's at a different level. I guess that's probably a good analogy for what the future industrial system will look like, in my view. Right? There will be.
Yeah, that's a great analogy. I love that. There is a sense very much in which the primary production, certainly of plants, you could even extend it to livestock if you wanted, but that's all automated already, right? I mean, at a different level of analysis, maybe but yes, that's a really interesting way to look at it.
So it's also, that's already an accurate way of thinking about, say, how the training loop works at Tesla, right? So they have this huge fleet. They don't drive the cars around. They just drive themselves from Tesla's point of view. Maybe the humans are driving sometimes, but anyway, the devices are out there moving around, collecting data. It goes back to the data center, and if you watch Andre Karpathy's talks, as I'm sure you have, and they talk about the way that learning system is designed, it's just learning all the time, and the engineers are mostly just managing the conditions of the learning. They're tagging certain things as being problematic, so the system knows to pay attention to them. But in some sense, that machine is just sitting there processing input without. It's like a next level thing beyond deep learning, where deep learning is you just have the input-output mapping you want to learn, and the machine goes off and learns it, and you're not telling it how to do the task, right? But there's a kind of industrial scale built on top of that, of which I think Tesla is a very good example, but there will be many, many more. And in protein engineering, this is already the case. So there's kind of like a race to make something like the Tesla of protein engineering, not in the sense of having lots of machines necessarily, but in terms of having this feedback loop between machines doing experiments and assays, feeding back into a learning process, and then designing new experiments, and having that loop happen to some extent entirely within the machines. And that's what it will look like in industry after industry. I think that's the first step along this path you're pointing at, where there will be these huge learning systems that are managed by people, but increasingly the people are kind of on the outside and just keeping the thing going, a bit like the farmer in the field, spraying pesticides when necessary, and building fences, and shoveling in horse manure from time to time. Right?
I think that's a fantastic analogy. A few things that are interesting there to me are that it may be okay. So take the example of a farm, and right now you can think of the system operating autonomously, or elements of the system operating autonomously already. I'm thinking of like plants doing the business of just producing, and that's sort of at the bottom of some stack of organization or activity, perhaps. And above that, you sort of have plants, and then at the next level of organization, you have farms and farmers, and which organize and manage that activity. And then at some higher level of organization, or perhaps just a larger physical scale, you have networks that process and that collect and gather and process and refine and manufacture various different things from these the outputs of farms, and then those are in turn distributed, and there's an even larger system of distributed network, distribution network and infrastructure and all of that stuff. And one can imagine different elements within that sort of stack becoming automated or becoming more automated, so that they require less and less human input, and we sort of, again, our the role would be pushed, the role of curating the process and just occasionally intervening, and stepping in, but the role can push the human role out to the periphery, out to the edges and at the margins and so forth. But what seems to me to be interesting is that you might be tempted to think that would happen sequentially, that the order in which that automation might occur would be through that scale. So, okay, we've done the plants first. The next thing that's going to happen is the farms, and then after that, it's going to happen, up at the secondary processing facilities and then after that, it would all happen at the distribution networks and infrastructure level, and out to restaurants and out to supermarkets and whatnot. And actually, probably not at all, right? Probably the automation just surges across all those levels simultaneously. And so that it's tempting as using space and spatial scale as your sort of as a hierarchical or vertical, some sort of stack structure to think through. That may be the wrong structure, the wrong way to think about things in terms of how the sequence at which automation rolls out. And it may be maybe a smart thing to do would be to look for another schema, another way, another stack of organization that actually will track the sequence more appropriately. And what would that be? What would the framing of that structure be? Like what would determine that? Complexity or what? I don't know. I'm not. Anyway, sorry. Just lurching forward towards one weird idea, I guess. But that's the first thing that comes to my mind.
Yeah, it's interesting. It reminds me of the discussions around internet economies of scale and how companies change their structure between, the Microsoft and Facebook are very different organizations, and the way their business models are different. And partly that's due to what became commoditized and what wasn't. I suppose commoditization is a term that goes hand in hand with automation, right? It's hard it's hard for something almost by definition, right? It's a commodity if you can reproduce it at large scale and the units are more or less identical, and that, at least historically, is hard to arrange without some kind of automation. So yeah, I don't know if you know, what's his blog? I think it's Derek. Is it Derek Thompson?
Derek Thompson. Why is that?
Let me look it
name's familiar.
Maybe it's Eric Thompson. I'm not sure. He has a great blog about tech. Stratechery, it's called.
Stratechery. Okay.
I think he's an American writer. He's living in Taiwan. I think it's just stratechery.com. I don't know where it comes from, the name. I guess strategy and tech. Right. So he's often a very insightful writer. He's kind of I view him as a successor to Clay Christensen.
Sure. Yeah.
He's very much a disciple of Christensen and applying some of that, but going beyond it, I think, in analysis of the modern tech industry. And he's often writing about aggregators as a sort of conceptual framework for talking about the internet economy and how Google and Facebook destroyed the old advertising-based industries by sort of disaggregating and reaggregating. I wonder whether that's I don't know, it's not a very clearly thought through idea, but when you were talking, it struck me as that might be a useful mental model of thinking about how, well, once automation applied to this stack probably leaves the stack completely changed in terms of where the value is and how it's organized, right? I guess that's actually, it's a question for you. I mean, have you looked at the disruption of agriculture by Monsanto? I mean, this probably doesn't count as a disruption, but people certainly worried that ownership of IP around very productive variants of crops would change where the value lay in agriculture and just turn farmers into people who were sharecropping because they had to rely on IP from companies like Monsanto. I never knew how seriously to take those sorts of descriptions, doom and gloom about farming due to Monsanto taking over everything. Doesn't seem to have happened, but
yeah, that's an interesting example. I will check with Brad about that particular example and whether or not he has any data or knowledge of that case, and whether or not it's a disruption or qualifies as a disruption. I mean, my knowledge is limited of Monsanto, about Monsanto's particular role, but I do know that one element that certainly would fit within our framework for understanding disruption is that it really is a new business model for sure. It's a new technology, glyphosate as a fertilizer that crops could be bred to be resistant to, and bred or designed in later cases. But that at any rate, crop species or cultivars of species could be made to be immune to this defoliating, this herbicide, and as a result, you could be hyper productive because you could just douse, you could absolutely blanket a field of these crops and obliterate every other plant, all the weeds and all competing, plants and stuff. And that was a really new way of operating, even by monocropping standards, a new way of operating a farm. And so it certainly was disruptive in that one sense. Now, whether or not that translates into a market disruption, like was there an S curve of adoption of that particular industrial agriculture monocropping practice in specific for specific commodities like corn and so forth, or is it did that business model just enter into the larger agriculture sort of practices ecosystem worldwide and not really qualify as a full disruption, seizing a great deal of market share and so forth? I'll check it out, but it's a great example because what it points to is that one of the key things that new technologies do is they don't simply cause a one-to-one replacement of an existing tool and no other changes. Ceteris paribus, nothing else changes. All else is equal. All else remains the same. That is typically not the pattern we see. What we see instead is that the markets tend to grow when a disruption occurs, because the new technology tends to create new opportunities to create value, new ways of doing things, and that's one aspect of that is new business models. And the business model that Monsanto obviously has been demonized for is owning the IP behind the plants that can withstand Roundup, and I believe they did. I mean, correct me if I'm wrong, but I'm associating terminator genes and basically the manipulation of crops so that you can't reseed them once you've got them. You have to keep purchasing seed from Monsanto, as well as the Roundup fertilizer that they manufacture. And because of that, they sort of own your entire, they own the IP around your entire operation. And so they are able to scrape, they're able to sort of seize a lot of the value out of that, even though you're much more productive that way. I mean, by some measures, I mean, not everybody's obviously happy with that form of agriculture, but in sort of, at least by some metrics, these fields become fantastically productive. They compared to 100 years ago, we're producing 5 times more calories per acre with the same crops, with corn on a given acre of land than we could a century ago, and that's an astonishing leap. So this is a great example. It's really interesting to think about, and it does point to this question of where will the new what new practices would emerge and who will own them. I mean, that's a whole other aspect of the automation question, right?
Yeah, we're gonna have to end there, I think. But
that's right. I forget we only have half an hour. Okay, I'm sorry.
No problem. That was very interesting. I just wanted to point out in closing that it's pretty amusing to sit here watching a killer robot express concern for the future of human beings and whether they will still be useful.
That's funny. That is funny.
Okay, thanks, Adam. I'm going to go to the next session, but I'll talk to you later.
Great. Thanks, Dan. Take care.
See ya.